Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. New Zealand's been making some big trade moves on the world trade stage recently. One of them is a possible minerals deal with the United States. The US is pushing to loosen China's grip on critical mineral processing by building alternate supply chains. But with talks well underway, what will the preliminary decline of a major seabed mining contract do to them? Today on The Front Page, Business Desk's Dileepa Fonseka is with us to discuss the deal and whether New Zealand's bitten off more than it can chew. So what do we know so far about the US minerals deal?
So the US is trying to basically set up what looks like a trading block for these critical minerals and rare earth elements. So that is some sort of arrangement with countries whereby there's a secondary source for a lot of these that's not China. And the Vice President of the US, J.D. Vance, he gave a speech where he, spoke about this. Interestingly, he chose not to name China in the speech. He just said when all of this mining is concentrated in one country's network, I guess.
One place, it has to be the Philippines.
Yeah, exactly. That's the only one they could be referring to, or us, perhaps, with all of our minerals. So there had been some earlier speculation that it could be, that they could be trying to threaten tariffs against countries if they didn't sign up to this. Don't know if that's going to come out later, but at least what they seem to be promoting in the kind of release text is more along the lines of they're going to use tariffs, but tariffs to establish price floors for these minerals. Because, this whole debate around critical minerals involves a lot of confusing terminology. We talk about rare earth elements, but they're not rare. They're actually in a lot of countries on Earth. The issue, though, is that China's established kind of a network for getting these, rare earths, and more importantly, they have large control of the refining, or they have a large amount of the refining capability, because they actually also use a lot of these. They're the leading producer of sort of renewable energy power. If you talk about solar panels, all that kind of thing, and all of those sorts of things, they use these rare earth elements. So they refine it, and they're also using it for manufacturing, and they've kind of cornered the market on it. US is obviously concerned because they obviously had the Trump tariff. He tried to impose tariffs on China. Then China went and imposed its own export controls on some of these rare earths. And that posed a problem for various US industries. And so the US suddenly discovered it didn't have leverage. And the US has actually been trying to do something about this for some time in terms of diversifying the supply. And part of the reason, when we talk about these critical minerals, part of the reason why these rare earths, why they're not so plentiful, I guess, why one country is kind of controlling a lot of the refining, is because their prices are not actually that high. The prices for them, the price for them in the world market. So the US kind of wants to establish a floor, and so they want to establish a minimum price kind of thing within this block. Thereby, countries can have confidence that, hey, if we open up to mining, then we sort of are going to be guaranteed kind of at least this price for it.
Right. So if you spend $1 billion on making a refining plant or a mining consent or something, you know that you're going to get $3 billion back or something. Whereas at the moment, you kind of just are throwing $1 billion at the wall.
Yeah, because you don't know, you don't know what the prices are going to be, and so far, if you look at the prices, they've been pretty volatile over time. And the US is also saying that they're going to plow money into investment. I think Australia has actually been on the receiving end, at least with some ideas around that and how US money might be used over there. That's all kind of part of the picture on the US critical minerals front, and New Zealand, of course, was there. And I think this is sort of got confused, I suppose, in the public, because this whole foreign policy debate is also tacked into a debate we have been having already about frogs and kiwis and mining, basically, right? And its place in New Zealand and whether we want to do it at all.
Yeah, don't forget the skinks and the Maui dolphins.
Oh,
They're
yeah, it's
brought up a fair bit as
hard
well.
to keep track of the
Well,
various species.
I kind of like, I read your opinion piece on this, and I like this line. First, the government denied it was happening, this US deal. Then, when everyone noticed it was happening, our politicians explained it really badly. So they were like, no, nothing to see here. But when everyone was like, hey, what's that? They were like, they didn't really own up to it or explain it really well. Is that kind of the vibe?
Basically. I mean, I think that it's, I don't think they did themselves any favors by sort of letting a lot of the stuff just leak out rather than fronting up and saying, this is what is happening, or this is what we're kind of involved in. And also, I think that they haven't really done much of a good job in terms of really getting across the case about what exactly these minerals are that we're talking about and what New Zealand's place in that would be, or even discussing it in public. Because I think there's a number of different roles that New Zealand could play in this hunt for, critical minerals. While we're discussing all of this, it's important to remember that, minerals is not just, we're not actually just interested in the ore. We're actually interested in the properties that these ores have. It's what we can kind of do with them, with how they conduct electricity, all this kind of stuff. And, that's the important part. And there are various ways of getting to that, right? One is, mining. Another one is, recycling and this kind of thing. We won't, get all the way there, probably on, just leaning on one of these strategies alone, even if it's, something like recycling, we probably will need to have new mining globally, more refining globally, but, different countries might have different parts to play in this.
Right. So we don't exactly know what our role is yet. We could become the world's leading recycler of laptop screens or something in the world, or getting stuff from that. You know what I mean? So it's not always going to be like pickaxe and getting coal and stuff.
Yeah, and if we want to be something different, I think that's sort of the role that we expect kind of politicians to play, because this, we're talking about something that's quite far removed from the market here. Like, this is not really like when we're talking this critical mineral debate and what the US is trying to do, this is not really like free market, global free market as we've been sort of practicing it for years, right? We're talking about preferences. We're talking about creating an alternative, because at the moment, the free market is sort of cornered, right? And we're not comfortable with that. And I think that would be an issue even if there weren't these geopolitical issues happening with China, and that's perhaps one element that I think I mentioned in my opinion piece. One element I think hasn't been really well communicated by a lot of New Zealand's leadership is that does not necessarily have to be a debate about China, because in any kind of situation where you've got all of your sort of minerals concentrated in one place, there are issues because in a world of climate change, you're going to actually face situations where particular countries, you may have something which actually affects the supply in that one country. And then what happens? Then there are going to be issues. And so, there's a situation in Chile where they've had something like a 1 in 1,000 year drought that's been going on for something like 15 years. And that affected their copper production. And so, there's various places that produce copper. They actually happen to be one of the largest, but, there's various places that provide copper. But what if that had happened in terms of some of these critical, refined products, critical minerals, and the supply had been more concentrated? That would be a big issue.
Well, it's a little bit embarrassing, actually, because it rippled very quickly up to Washington, D.C., where New Zealand had top government officials talking about how New Zealand could be part of a global supply chain. And so to do that, we've got to be able to mine, right? And vanadium is one of the critical minerals that the world's after. So this decision, it's a preliminary decision, so I like to wait till the very end to form a conclusion. So I just have to hope that facts, evidence and science prevail at the end of the day when the final decision is made.
So how does all of this tie into, so that's what's happening on the global stage with the minerals. What about this preliminary decline of TTR's South Taranaki seabed mining project?
Yeah, so that's the New Zealand end of the debate, right? Because while we're having the critical minerals debate, we're actually having a parallel debate about whether we should be mining, where how much do we want to do? What kind of value are we going to get out of it? So TTR, Trans-Tasman Resources, have been having a big, it's been going on for years. This whole idea about mining the seabed in Taranaki, and they got into themselves into the fast track as a shortlist process. That was never a automatic. Although that, maybe portrayed as such, there was never an automatic granting of a consent. And in some ways, the fast track panel has kind of proved its chops. They've declined they've declined the application. And I haven't looked at their share price off the top of my head, but it had some significant declines immediately after that. So after that decision was released, New Zealand shareholders actually got a little bit worse off than their Australian counterparts, because the release on that came out on Thursday evening, and Friday was Waitangi Day, so the markets were closed. But it's dual listed, so on the ASX investors got a bit of a head start. Not selling out. That whole debate is raging as well, and they're sort of saying that there'll be critical minerals that they could have mined out of that as well,
like uranium or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think with a lot of the stuff, you can have a lot of these. I think it's important to remember that the prices of some of these are not necessarily, not all of them. Just because you have a critical mineral doesn't mean that the world is in shortage. The issue is actually not the world is in shortage. The world just doesn't have as many diverse amounts of supply. So where do we get that? Where do we get that from? Do we? And there may be some that you don't. That not all of it needs to come from New Zealand. But then again, maybe some of it does.
Minerals CEO Josie Vidal, she's called it embarrassing and damaging to New Zealand's global reputation during these US negotiations, that seabed mining decline before the decline. So we get the actual decline or approval in March. Would you agree that it is embarrassing and it may damage negotiations with the US?
I wouldn't have thought so, because there's only one project. And I don't, I don't even know. I mean, I think that there's other big reserves that they're talking about. There's some, on the West Coast. I saw, some about that. There'll always be, there are multiple ideas of where some of these minerals could be. And, I think that the US, they would want some kind of certainty when it comes to, investing. But, arguably, if you're on the other side, you might look at this and say, well, in some ways the fast-track regime ensures a degree of certainty, because the decline is a decline. It happened relatively quickly. If you're reading the decision, it does seem relatively comprehensive in terms of what they've gone through. I wouldn't pretend to be a resource management lawyer, but at least from the outside of the decision, it's quite long. They've gone through a number of things. They have acknowledged the benefits, but then they seem to have said that in some ways there are some scenarios where they don't feel like enough information has been provided, or that that it's not going. If that scenario happened, then it would sort of overrule some of these economic benefits. I mean, that you're always going to have debates over whether any one proposal, how important it's going to be, and mining industry is going to have a view on that, and there are going to be mining experts who are going to have a view on the impact that has. I don't know whether that decision itself is going to sink our prospects.
Sink our hopes and dreams in the US.
I mean, there are other places too that we could get, other projects that we could do, minerals. They might not be as far advanced, but there are other minerals, and there are, but there are problems. Perhaps with some of the ways that we're looking at mining. There are projects that are facing issues. You talk about kind of gold projects and the South Island. There's, there is a sort of degree of uncertainty that some of the miners see is floating around. And, depending on, that is always going to be a problem for miners. But I think on the other end of things, what you've also got to realize is that a lot of these mining companies, they're looking for places where this investment is going to work out over a very long term because they make quite a big investment. So they want it to actually, they don't necessarily want to completely alienate the community that they don't want something that is not really wanted by the community necessarily, because they're going to have to be there for a
because sometimes these contracts are like 100 years or something.
Yeah. Like they're definitely, because, that's the amount of time that it takes for a lot of the investment to pay off.
Yeah.
And I also think as a country, we've perhaps spent a lot of time talking about this minerals and the cash we can get out of it. But really, like, a lot of the benefits of it are some of the ancillary stuff, the involvement in mining technology, the, growth. There's some New Zealand companies doing some great things around mining technology. And, the more of a minerals industry that we have in New Zealand, the more opportunity there is to develop that kind of technology. Of course, it has to be a particular scale, but, there's more opportunity. There are these kind of opportunities, so it's not just, we're shipping off the ore and the company's getting some money and we're getting some royalties, and maybe there's some people being employed in the local community. There's other impacts as well.
Thanks for joining us, Dileepa.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is hosted and produced by me, Chelsea Daniels. Kane Dickey is our studio operator, Richard Martin, our producer and editor, and our executive producer is Jane Yee. Follow The Front Page on the iHeart app or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time for another look beyond the headlines.